I want to read a quote that came from George Barna after reflecting on one of the Barna surveys. He said this: "The central conclusion is that the American church is dying due to a lack of strong leadership. In this time of unprecedented opportunity and plentiful resources, the church is actually losing influence. The primary reason is the lack of leadership." How can we be in this day and age with being blessed with so many opportunities, so many available means of communicating the gospel, but yet find ourselves on the decline? The simple truth, the hard truth, is that we have a leadership crisis. The crisis is found in churches throughout the world. Many times, it is not because there are no people to lead. The problem is that there are those that do not want to lead. And so they kick that can down the road. They push that on to someone else. Bear Valley has been involved in a program for about 30 plus years. It's called Military Outreach. It's where a military base can contact us and say, we would like somebody to come and teach us for a week or 2 weeks. And we do it totally free of charge to that local church. They do not have to pay a dime for any of us to come over. It's a ministry that we do. Well, one time I was involved in one of the military outreach trips, and I had an opportunity to preach for another church, not the church that invited me over, but another church. And I got lost, and first of all, I was not preaching at that church. I was just going to go visit that church. And I got lost, and so I got there late. But the sign said Church of Christ, and so, okay. So I went in, and there was a woman that was leading singing. And I was a little taken back by that. And then after she got done leading the singing, another woman got up to say a prayer. And I'm looking, and there are men here, there are men there. And so finally, I couldn't resist. I said, "Excuse me, but the sign outside said Church of Christ. Am I in the wrong place?" And they said, no, this is the Church of Christ. And I said, "I'm confused on why you ladies are conducting the worship." And they said, "Because the men won't do anything." And I said, "Would it be okay if I preached?" They said, "We would be so thankful if you would." Anybody want to take a wild guess on what I preached on? So men were there, but men were not willing to lead. A leadership crisis, and so the void was filled by women that were trying to do the right thing. And they asked me later, what should we do? What should we have done? And I told them the men either needed to step up and lead, or they needed to be kicked out and asked to not be there, so that it's just a church of women. The problem is not that there were not men. The problem was not that there were not men that had no leadership skills. These were military men, some of them of high rank, but not of high rank in the Lord's church. Those that were willing to do something by way of leading in the church. that story, unfortunately, is not that unique. It might be that it's unique in the sense that there are literally no men that are willing to step up, but sometimes there's only one or two. And so the bulk of the entire service falls upon that one man or two men to say all the prayers, to preside at the Lord's Supper, to do the sermon, and so on. When there are other men that are there, but are not willing to lead. I want us to go on a journey together this morning that goes back to the Old Testament and actually goes back to the days that the Israelites went into the land of Canaan, the promised land. When archaeologists and historians began to uncover the history of the ancient Canaanites, they found, as they suspected, a polytheistic society. But what they didn't expect to find was in regard to the Canaanite gods. The number one most powerful god was named El. He was the supreme God, and most scholars believe that he was the God that was most like the Israelites' Yahweh. He was viewed as all-powerful and all-knowing. And naturally, with a God like this, archaeologists expected that they would find a lot of evidence of El worship, images, temples, numerous references to this God. But they didn't find references to El. They found virtually nothing about him except a few small coins and a few secondary references. Meanwhile, the archaeologists were totally shocked that they were continually finding images, carvings, references to this God. This God was named Baal. Probably correctly pronounced would be Baal. We typically say Baal, B-A-A-L. Literally hundreds of images of Baal have been uncovered, and we might suspect that the Bible writers would most frequently make mention of El, but they don't say one word about El, but they mention Baal over 125 times in the Old Testament. So it's clear that Baal was the preferred god of the Canaanites. Even stone carvings have been found honoring Baal and acknowledging the fact that he was the main god that was worshipped by the ancient Canaanites. We have uncovered cities where that were named for this god, but no cities that were named for the supreme god, and that was El. For example, we found numerous temples that were specifically for the worship of Baal. Here are the remnants of a Baal temple in Beirut. Here is another temple in Syria. And you can see that the Baal temple was a massive complex designed to accommodate literally thousands of worshipers at one particular time. And this actually explains why eventually the Israelites came to worship this god by the name of Baal. So, who was Baal? He was the Canaanite storm god. El was visualized in the Canaanite theology as the one who sat on his throne high above, far removed from the people. Baal, who was his son, was considered to be the god that controlled the rains, storms, vegetation. Baal was therefore the one that ultimately determined whether you were going to have food to eat, whether your crops were going to grow, whether you'd have a meal on your table. So it was probably for this reason that El has no prominence in the biblical text, but El is clearly shown to be the main god of the Canaanites. The Canaanite worshipers saw value in worshiping Baal because he was personally involved in their lives. He was the one that brought good things. He was the one that punished them with bad things when they were unfaithful. This is why Joshua found a number of locations that had the name of Baal attached to them. And if you read the book of Joshua, you can see many of those names. The Israelites came to believe that Baal could do more for them than Yahweh could. They needed to have food on their tables, and they came to believe that Baal could deliver that food. They needed to have good weather to travel and for the growing of crops and so on. Baal was the god they thought would provide that. In nearly every major area of their lives, the Canaanite god Baal was a god that could deliver. At least they thought could deliver. So they forgot Jehovah, Yahweh, and served the Baals, like this text in Judges chapter 3 and verse 7. Occasionally then, they would return to the Lord when they had a great leader and when they grew tired of the slavery to the nations around them. But as soon as that leader died, they played the harlot with the Baals, as Judges 8 verse 33 confirms. They made Baal Berith their god. I'm actually going to talk about that second word, Berith, tomorrow. It's a word that means covenant. The Lord was their covenant God. He was the one who at Mount Sinai promised to take care of them. If they were faithful, promised to give them long lives, prosperous herds, bumper crops, physical health, no miscarriages, and so on. Somewhere along the line, though, they decided that Baal could deliver, but the Lord would not deliver. And so they worshiped Baal, just like the Canaanites did, even so far as to sacrifice their children to this Canaanite god. And then we read the story about one man. One amazing Bible character by the name of Elijah. The worship of Baal had been going on a long time. It occurred through the period of the judges down through the period of the kings. It had been happening, best that we can discern, for well over 400 years. And then Elijah comes on the scene. And Elijah comes on the scene and is going to confront the people and force them to make a decision. One of the great Bible verses in Bible questions is found in 1 Kings 18, verse 21. He says, Elijah came near to all the people and said, "How long will you hesitate between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal, follow him." But the people did not answer him a word. No amens. No, we're going to serve the Lord. The people kept quiet because they were not going to affirm their allegiance to Baal, certainly with Elijah there. So you remember the story that is told in 1 Kings 18. On Mount Carmel, Elijah comes up with an idea that is going to separate the legitimacy of Baal from Jehovah, the one true God. And he is one that says, you priests of Baal, build your altar cry out to Baal to come and to consume the sacrifice. Well, 400 plus priests of Baal think that's a pretty good plan. And so Elijah is more than generous with the time. He gives them from morning until the late afternoon, even to the time of the evening sacrifice. That means that those priests of Baal had from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. to get Baal to reply. They had 8 hours. 8 hours of time to get him to reply. But verse 29 says, they cried, "O Baal, answer us." But there was no voice, no one answered. And there was, verse 26, and then verse 29, and there was no voice, no one answered, and no one paid attention. And then it was Elijah's turn. Elijah constructed an altar of stone, put the sacrifice on it, put the wood on it, and then built a trench around it, and then absolutely drenched everything with water, with more water, with more water, until even the trench was full. And then he cries, "Lord, let it be known this day that thou art God." And you know the story, right? You know how God replied to the prayer of Elijah. You know, artists have depicted this particular scene of how God kind of sends an answer and it consumes the altar. Here our artist has kind of a funky looking lightning bolt that strikes the altar. This isn't exactly how I visualized it. Here's a couple of other artist rendition. Maybe we're getting a little bit closer to that. This one over here, maybe that's a little closer. But honestly, this is how I visualize it. God just basically nukes the whole thing. That is God in a mighty show of power demonstrates that He is the real God. Now the rest of the text there in 1 Kings sees an amazing shift of allegiance to Jehovah. And now they're actually killing the prophets of Baal and worshiping the Lord. Now, we went on this journey to bring us to this point. It's really a statement that I get from J.W. McGarvey in his book, Fourfold Gospel. You probably have that book in your library if you've been in the church for very long. He made the statement, religion is only powerful as it becomes personal. Religion's powerful as it becomes personal. Our religion, our relationship with God is no better than the ancient Israelites unless we have and maintain a personal relationship with Him. We offer Him more than lip service, but instead give Him life service. We're not going to hesitate between two opinions, between God and Satan. Your being here is commendable today, and I thank you for that. But that isn't going to make Satan quit in trying to discourage you from working and serving in the church. He's even more determined to get you on his side. And so we need to be aware of that. Don't hesitate between God and laziness. Sometimes when there is a lot of work to do, the worst part of us emerges. We become lazy. Those who succeed here do so because God is at work in their lives. And they do work for Him. They study for Him. They do the work of the church for Him. Don't hesitate between God and grumbling. Attitude is the key to success. When demands are placed on us, we can easily succumb to grumbling and complaining. Yet we must remind ourselves that why we're here, the role that we play in the Lord's church, and we are moved to get to work and not to grumble and complain. We can't hesitate between God and impurity. Maybe Satan can't get to you with laziness. Maybe he cannot get to you with a bad attitude, but he can defeat you through immorality. Paul had to remind Timothy, for example, in 2 Timothy 2, verse 22, that he needs to make sure that he keeps himself pure, a vessel that God can use. I love the imagery of the vessel. Have you ever looked into the cabinet and found a glass that was not clean? But you went ahead and used it anyway, right? No, of course not. No, you put that back in the sink or in the dishwasher and you're going to give it another run through. You're not going to drink out of that. Well, Paul is using that illustration, only we are the vessel, and God is reaching for us, wanting to use us, but we're not what we need to be, and so God can't use us, because if He did use us, it would not advance His cause. We can't hesitate between two opinions. We need to be someone that we're all in. We're all in with God. We're all in with the work of God. You know, James makes the statement in James chapter 5 and verse 17 that Elijah was a man with a nature like ours. You know, sometimes we put a superhero costume on these Bible characters, and we make guys like Elijah out to be more than they were. And what they were just men. Men that wanted to serve God. Men that wanted to make a difference. So here is the challenge that we have before us in talking about a leadership void, is someone needs to choose to serve. You know, we asked the question, what if Elijah had not been willing to step up and get the job done? And I was making reference to the beginning of this church. What if there were not men and women that were saying, we need to start a church here, a church that's going to impact this community? And as I was mentioning before, what if those three men at Bear Valley had not said, we're going to start a new church? And, well, so now 60 plus years down the road, we're seeing what it is that God can do through one man or two men and women stepping up. Elijah was not a superhero. And God wants to tell us, and does tell us, in James 5:17, he's a man with a nature like ours. Rush Limbaugh said, there is a void of leadership in a lot of Washington. I think one of the reasons why there is so much angst across the country. There's always those that are recognizing that there is a void, but not recognizing how they want to do something about the void. So what is leadership? When we talk about leadership, sometimes we have a very narrow vision. And in the first session, I tried to remind us, especially to the ladies among us, that there are roles of leadership for you in God's church. And we clarified, we're not talking about preaching and teaching. We're not talking about leading the church in the role of elders. But leadership in the church, leadership in women's programs, leadership in teaching children, leadership in the home. How do we address the void? We address the void when the women among us say, I'm going to do my part. When the men among us say, I'm going to do my part. Rather than that church that I was making reference to just a minute ago, where the men have filled the pews on the back row of the church and the women are up doing everything. That's addressing the void. When we think about leadership, we recognize that it is a journey. It's a road that we need to get on, the leadership road that's going to lead us to making this church a better church, making the programs here better programs. True leadership is that which is centered. It's centered on Christ. It's centered on the Bible. It is centered on people. It's centered. We are keeping the main thing the main thing. And we're not losing ourselves in programs that ultimately are not advancing the agenda of God. There was an article in U.S. News and World Report, which was an interesting place for this article to be found, that was talking about a denominational church that had a massive food kind of giveaway. And they advertised, they rented billboards, and they said, free food, just come by. Well, there were people that came out of the woodwork to go through the soup lines, and literally hundreds of people came to this church in the Northeast. Well, the reporter that wrote the story also went there and went to one of the people and said, is there a Bible I could have? Well, you would have thought that the guy asked for $1 million. They just got a stunned look, and they went to ask someone else and said, do we have any Bibles around here? And they went to someone else who went to someone else who went to someone else. And finally they came back and said, sorry, we don't have any Bibles. The church was serving food, but not connected with God's agenda. Now the food, that's a good idea, but it's not the end, it's a means to the end. It has the point of leading people to the gospel of Christ, leading people to become a part of God's kingdom. Leadership is centered on God's plan for the church. And as we ask the question, what is it that God wants the church that meets in this place to be and do? It needs to be centered on God's plan for the church and what it is that the church is supposed to be, and that's a soul-saving, soul-assuring body of people. Which leads us to the second point about leadership. It needs to be compassionate. If we're not keeping the main thing, then typically it's because there's really not that love for the lost, really not a concern for the lost. Now, some have studied this and have come to the conclusion that there are basically two reasons why there's no longer a mission effort in so many churches. One is that we have grown very comfortable and very lazy in our Christianity. And so apathy has won the day. Others have said that it's because we're no longer see people as being lost. That what the Bible describes as the children of God has basically been discarded, and we have replaced it with our own view of who's lost, who's saved. And there are a lot of people that are just good people. They're not religious people. They don't follow the Bible. But in some way, we have convinced ourselves that they're still saved. True compassion is that which is recognizing that there is a judgment day. There is a great day coming. And all are going to appear before the judgment seat of Christ to be judged according to the deeds that they've done in the body, whether good or evil. 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 10. Jesus says an hour is coming when all who are in the tomb shall hear his voice and come forth. Those who did the good deeds to a resurrection of life. Those who did the evil deeds to a resurrection of judgment. Our compassionate hearts should be that which we see the people in the grocery store. We see the people in the neighborhood. We see the people in the workplace. And we're thinking souls. We're thinking these are people that need the gospel of Christ. That's a role of leadership that all of us should share. And then third, leadership is committed. Committed to the agenda of God. Committed to being and doing what it is that God wants us to be and do. And we can be committed to a lot of things. And sometimes those things are secondary to God's plan and what God is really wanting us to be committed to. Why is there a leadership void? Well, there's a leadership void because we're not centered on God. We don't have the compassionate love for God and His work and the kind of commitment that we need in order to really be what God needs us to be and step into that role.